Michael Jackson lived like a man with unlimited money. He owned a private amusement park, flew on chartered jets on a whim, bought art and antiques by the truckload, and built a 700-acre fantasy estate complete with its own zoo and fire department. It's easy to see why the popular imagination has turned him into a trillionaire figure in the years since his death. His lifestyle was genuinely that extravagant. But the real financial story behind Michael Jackson is stranger, and in some ways more remarkable, than any inflated number could capture. He was never a trillionaire, or even, by the time of his death, a man with a positive net worth at all. What he actually built was something far more unusual, one of the most valuable, most mismanaged, and ultimately most successful posthumous fortunes in entertainment history. From Gary, Indiana, to global icon Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, in Gary, Indiana, the seventh of 9 children in a family that would become the Jackson Five. Under the strict direction of his father, Joseph Jackson, Michael began performing professionally as a young child, and by his teenage years had already become one of the most recognizable entertainers in the world. His solo career, launched fully with 1979's Off the Wall, reached an entirely different stratosphere with 1982's Thriller. Still, by most counts, the best-selling album of all time, with estimates ranging as high as 70 million copies sold worldwide, at the height of his career, from roughly 1985 through the mid-1990s, Jackson was earning somewhere between $50 million and $100 million a year, through album sales, touring, endorsements, and one of the shrewdest business decisions of his career, acquiring music publishing rights. In 1984, he purchased the ATV music catalog, which included publishing rights to a large portion of the Beatles catalog, for roughly $47.5 million. That single purchase later merged with Sony's own publishing arm to form Sony/ATV Music Publishing, would ultimately become the single most valuable asset Jackson ever owned, worth billions of dollars in the years after his death. A lifestyle without limits by almost any account, Jackson's day-to-day life matched the scale of his fame. His primary residence, and the property most associated with his name, was Neverland Ranch, a 700-acre estate in Los Olivos, California, purchased in 1988 for roughly $17 to $19.5 million. Jackson didn't simply live there, he transformed it into a private amusement park, adding a zoo stocked with exotic animals, a fully functioning train and station, a Ferris wheel, a go-kart track, a movie theater seating 50 guests, and even the estate's own private fire department. Estimates suggest he spent an additional $35 million or more, turning the property into that fantasy landscape, on top of the millions it cost annually just to maintain and staff. Beyond Neverland, Jackson's spending touched nearly every category of luxury imaginable. He was known for buying art and antiques by the roomful, filling his properties with fine furniture, sculptures, and collectibles. He kept an extensive private zoo that, at various points, included a chimpanzee, named Bubbles, who became almost as famous as Jackson himself. He purchased jewelry, including a well-documented fondness for a single, custom-made diamond-studded glove, luxury cars, and extravagant costuming for tours and music videos that pushed the boundaries of what concert production had ever attempted before. He financed ambitious creative projects, including the 1997 short film Ghosts, co-written with novelist Stephen King, which alone reportedly cost around $65 million to produce despite limited commercial release. By most financial reconstructions of his spending habits, maintaining Jackson's lifestyle cost somewhere between $30 million and $50 million every single year, a figure that, even at the height of his earning power, began to outpace what even a global superstar could sustainably generate. The debt behind the glamour. This is where Michael Jackson's real financial story diverges sharply from any trillionaire narrative. Rather than accumulating wealth over his lifetime, Jackson spent nearly every dollar he earned, and then borrowed heavily against his most valuable asset to keep spending after his income slowed. In the early 2000s, he took out a loan reportedly worth $270 million, using his 50% stake in Sony ATV as collateral, and according to testimony later given in a 2013 wrongful death trial, he managed to spend through that entire sum plus an additional $120 million, within just a few years. He later took on an even larger loan, reported at roughly $380 million from Bank of America, again secured against his publishing catalog, with annual interest payments alone running into the tens of millions of dollars. Court documents examined by financial reporters showed that by 2007, Jackson held roughly $567.6 million in assets, offset by $331 million in debt, and less than $700,000 in actual cash on hand, an almost unbelievable liquidity crunch for a man whose name was synonymous with wealth. Legal costs compounded the problem. He paid an estimated $20 million to settle a 1993 civil case, alongside a reported $12 million divorce settlement with his second wife, Debbie Rowe, on top of ongoing legal fees tied to years of litigation and media scrutiny. By 2008, Jackson was facing foreclosure on Neverland Ranch itself. His lender sold the roughly $25 million debt tied to the property to private equity firm Colony Capital, and Jackson entered a joint venture arrangement to avoid losing the estate outright, effectively ceding significant control over the property that had once been the physical embodiment of his fame. According to court filings released in 2024, by the time of his death on June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson was approximately $500 million in debt. With more than 65 separate creditor claims outstanding, many already in default and accruing steep interest, he was reportedly accumulating new debt at a pace of roughly $30 million a month in the final period of his life. Preparing for a comeback. It's worth noting that Jackson wasn't simply drowning passively in debt at the time of his death. He was actively working to dig his way out of it. In the months before he died, he had signed on for This Is It, a planned 50-date concert residency at London's O2 Arena, widely reported to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars in potential earnings, and seen by those close to him as his best remaining chance to stabilize his finances. Randy Phillips, then CEO of AEG Live, the company producing the residency, later told Rolling Stone that Jackson wanted audiences to focus on his artistry rather than his personal life, describing him as a far more calculated businessman behind the scenes than his public image as a fragile, otherworldly figure suggested. Jackson died during rehearsals for that residency, of acute propofol intoxication, before a single official show had taken place, leaving behind both an extraordinary debt load and an equally extraordinary, if deeply undervalued, collection of assets, the fortune he never got to see. What happened next is arguably the more remarkable half of Michael Jackson's financial story. His will, signed in 2002, placed his estate into the Michael Jackson Family Trust, naming attorney John Branca and music executive John McClain as co-executors, and designating that 20% of the estate go to charity, with the remainder split between his mother, Katherine Jackson, and his three children, Prince, Paris, and Biggie, formerly Blanket, Jackson. Rather than liquidating Jackson's most valuable assets to pay off his debts immediately, Branca and McClain instead worked to grow and professionally manage the estate's holdings, most critically, its stake in Sony ATV. That decision paid off spectacularly. The estate eventually sold its 50% stake in Sony ATV for $750 million in 2016, and continued licensing Jackson's music, image, and creative works across concert films, Cirque du Soleil productions, a Broadway musical, and, most recently, a major biopic that became one of the highest-grossing films of 2026. In 2016 alone, Forbes recorded $825 million in earnings attributed to the estate, the single largest annual total ever recorded for a deceased celebrity at that time. By 2026, 17 years after his death and roughly $500 million in the red, Michael Jackson's estate is estimated to be worth approximately $2 billion. A transformation so dramatic that it has become a frequently studied case in entertainment finance, proof that the value of an artist's catalog can, with the right management, ultimately dwarf even the most reckless spending habits of the artist its own lifetime. A business empire beyond music. It's worth remembering that Jackson wasn't simply a spender. For much of his career, he was also an unusually astute businessman, at least in terms of the assets he chose to acquire. Beyond the landmark ATV catalog purchase, he built a broader portfolio of music publishing rights that, over the years, came to include songs by artists ranging from Sly and the Family Stone to early rock and roll classics like Great Balls of Fire. That instinct, recognizing decades before most of his peers that owning the rights to music, rather than simply performing it, was where the real long-term value lay, is a big part of why his estate eventually became so valuable, even as his personal spending habits worked in the opposite direction. His touring business, too, operated on a scale most performers of his era never approached. The Bad World Tour, the Dangerous World Tour, and the History World Tour, each ranked among the highest-grossing and most elaborately produced tours of their respective decades, featuring stage productions, pyrotechnics, and choreography that pushed the technical limits of live concert production at the time. Those tours generated enormous revenue, but they also came with correspondingly enormous production costs, feeding directly into the same cycle of massive income, offset by even more massive spending, that defined much of his adult financial life. Philanthropy and public image. Jackson was also, by most credible accounts, one of the more generous celebrity philanthropists of his generation, even as his personal finances deteriorated. He was recognized by Guinness World Records for supporting more charitable causes than any other entertainer, contributing to organizations focused on children's welfare, HIV and AIDS research, and disaster relief efforts around the world. That generosity, combined with his elaborate lifestyle, created a public image that often blurred the line between calculated business strategy and genuine personal conviction. Attention biographers and financial reporters have continued to debate in the years since his death without ever fully resolving which motivation weighed more heavily in any given decision. His properties extended well beyond Neverland Ranch as well. At various points in his life, Jackson maintained residences and rented estates in locations including Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and briefly in Bahrain, following his relocation there. After his 2005 acquittal on child molestation charges, each of these residences came with its own significant costs in staffing, security, and upkeep, adding further strain to finances that were already stretched thin by the demands of Neverland alone. The real legacy. Michael Jackson was never a trillionaire, and by the time of his death, he wasn't even, in the strictest accounting sense, a wealthy man. He was a hugely famous, hugely indebted artist whose lifestyle had long since outpaced his income. But the assets underlying that lifestyle, particularly the music catalog he had the foresight to acquire decades earlier, turned out to be worth far more than even he likely understood in his final years. That gap between the man who died deeply in debt and the estate that would go on to earn billions in the years that followed, is, in its own way, a more compelling story than any trillionaire headline could offer. A reminder that true wealth in the entertainment industry often isn't measured by what an artist spends in their lifetime, but by what they quietly build, sometimes without even realizing it, for the decades that follow. It's a story that continues to evolve even now, nearly 2 decades after his death. The record-breaking success of the 2026 biopic, Michael, combined with a resurgence in streaming numbers for his catalog and ongoing licensing deals across film, theater, and music, means the financial legacy Jackson left behind is still, in a very real sense, being written. His children, none of whom had access to significant portions of the estate's growing wealth during their father's lifetime, given how deeply in debt he was when he died, have since become the primary beneficiaries of a fortune built almost entirely, posthumously, through decisions made by executors rather than choices Jackson himself ever had the chance to make. In that sense, perhaps the most fitting way to understand Michael Jackson's financial life isn't as the story of a trillionaire at all, but as the story of an artist whose true fortune was never fully realized until long after the cameras, the debts, and the man himself were gone. Financial figures regarding Michael Jackson's assets, debts, and estate value are drawn from court filings, published financial reporting, and industry estimates, and vary somewhat between sources. Michael Jackson was not a trillionaire during his lifetime. At the time of his death, court documents indicate he was approximately $500 million in debt,